Hello. Let's take a few minutes to imagine what would happen if our planet lost the sun. This scenario isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. All it would take is a rogue planet passing relatively close to us. Its gravity could easily eject Earth from the solar system. In 2017, scientists discovered that our galaxy, the Milky Way, contains around 100 billion rogue planets. Planets that lost their stars long ago and now drift alone through space. Now let me tell you what would happen to us and our planet if we lost the sun. So let's imagine that the sun disappears suddenly and for reasons unknown to us, and humanity has no time to prepare for this apocalypse. From that point on, events would unfold rapidly. Our planet would drift into the unknown, taking the moon along with it, but we would hardly see the moon in the sky anymore, since it would no longer reflect sunlight. The stars, on the other hand, would shine brighter than ever before, as there would be no solar radiation to outshine them. The entire planet would plunge into eternal darkness. Outside the cities, it would become 300 times darker than a clear, full moon night. Mass unrest would erupt in many parts of the world. People living in hot countries, realizing the extreme cold that's coming and understanding their homes are not built for freezing temperatures, would begin fleeing en masse to regions of Earth where infrastructure can support harsh winters. At first, power plants would continue to function normally, providing people with light and heat. Some estimates suggest that within the first 3 days, the average temperature on Earth would drop to 0 degrees Celsius. A rapid freeze wouldn't happen immediately, only because the atmosphere and oceans would still hold on to some heat for a while. 1 week after the sun's disappearance, the average temperature on Earth, according to some estimates, would drop to around -17 to 20 degrees Celsius, while other calculations suggest it could fall only to -3. Within a couple of weeks, most plant life would perish due to the lack of photosynthesis and the onset of the cold. Large trees would survive a bit longer, thanks to their significant nutrient reserves. From that moment on, no new oxygen would be produced in the atmosphere, but the existing supplies would last for a long time for several reasons. First, because after the death of the plants, there would be a mass extinction of oxygen consumers, animals and humans. Second, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere is so vast that even if consumption rates remain the same, it would still be enough for hundreds, if not thousands of years. 1 year after the sun's disappearance, the average temperature on Earth would fall, according to some estimates, to around -70 degrees Celsius, while others suggest it would be closer to -40. Thus, developed countries would only have the first few months to build survival arcs under relatively manageable conditions, assuming, of course, that widespread panic, mass riots, and the flood of people from less developed nations wouldn't interfere. The governments of many major countries would become dysfunctional, and an avalanche-like decentralization of authority would begin. There would be no real control over the situation, as responding to such rapidly changing conditions while managing a huge population would become impossible. Given that it would only get colder and colder, it would become obvious to people that sooner or later it would be impossible to keep most types of power plants operational. Thus, one of the most promising areas for relocation would be regions with geothermal sources. For example, Iceland already heats more than 80% of its homes using geothermal energy. The main advantage of such energy is its practical inexhaustibility and independence from environmental conditions, time of day, or season. Therefore, there would be a mass migration of the population towards such sources of heat. All of this would be accompanied by anarchy, chaos, mass killings, and widespread death from starvation. 1.5 years after the disappearance of the sun, the average temperature on Earth would reach -100 degrees Celsius. The oceans would be covered with at least a 10-meter thick layer of ice. At that point, going outside without a spacesuit would mean certain death within a few minutes. A single breath of air would freeze your lungs. This means that everyone who failed to settle in a safe and warm place within the first 12 to 16 months would perish. However, the rate of cooling on the planet would noticeably slow down. Nevertheless, over the course of 10 years, as the temperature drops to -125 degrees Celsius, The air would become so cold that its gases would begin to condense and fall as precipitation, first in liquid form, and then as solid snow. Because of this, the atmosphere would gradually become thinner and thinner. Without a pressure-stabilizing spacesuit, it would no longer be possible to leave a bunker. Humanity would be forced to plan ahead by building oxygen production stations, or by harvesting and melting solidified air from the surface. People would also need to find a way to manufacture spare parts for machinery, generators, and other essential equipment, as well as create a biosphere with artificial lighting to enable photosynthesis in plants. In the oceans, the thick layer of ice would serve as a good insulator from the hostile atmosphere, allowing small underwater organisms, which are capable of living without light and oxygen at great depths, warmed by geothermal vents, to survive. These deep-sea organisms process heat, methane, and sulfur into energy, which they critically need to survive. 200 years after the disappearance of the sun, Earth would be frozen solid for kilometers deep. However, thanks to the planet's hot core, there would still be liquid water with microbes beneath the thick ice, and it would remain that way for billions of years. David Stevenson, professor of planetary science at the California Institute of Technology, believes that millions of years after the sun's disappearance, Earth would reach a stable temperature of minus 160 degrees Celsius, where the heat coming from the planet's core would balance the heat radiated into space. Essentially, Earth would become a spacecraft for microbes, and perhaps even for larger organisms living at the bottom of the ocean. As for whether humanity could survive even the first 100 years after the sun disappears, that remains a highly debatable question. If our star vanished suddenly, building the massive, fully self-sustaining arcs or shelters necessary for survival within a very short time frame, before falling temperatures made construction vastly more difficult, would be an extremely tough challenge. If, however, we could predict the sun's disappearance at least 5 years in advance, the chances of our species' survival would increase dramatically. But even if humanity perishes, there remains a small chance that billions of years later, our wandering planet could find a new star similar to the sun, start orbiting it. And as the oceans thaw, surviving microbes could spark a new race of evolution, perhaps even reaching the stage of intelligent life once again. That's it for now. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.